If you're a movie collector, you need Movies Anywhere. It pulls your favorite purchase movies from participating digital retailers into one central place, so you can finally say goodbye to scattered movie collections and hello to an organized library. With Movies Anywhere, you can watch your favorite movies on any compatible device, whenever and wherever you want. Ready to grow and enjoy your digital collection? Visit moviesanywhere.com/welcome and register for free. Registration with Movies Anywhere required. Open to U.S. residents 13 and over.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. I have my friend Roland Elliott again, and he is an awesome guest. And we talked about his philosophical views on why he believes in God and how it led to him being a Christian, and at the end I just asked him why are we here, and how should we act as Christians. But now I want to dive more into him being a theologian, because he does introduce himself as at night as a philosopher and a theologian. So hey Roland, how are you, man?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I guess I walked into that, didn't I? Introducing myself as both. I should have just picked one and then it would have been easier. But I do like to study both and particularly how to do each on their own merits, but then also how to combine them together in a helpful way that's constructive and makes every part of the system a bit clearer.
Yeah, so you presented yourself as sort of taking the Aristotelian approach to philosophy, right? And then you also said that you could match theology and philosophy, in an Aristotelian way too, right? Would you have said that?
I guess I like the analogy of the two books. So you have the two books of God, or you could say I guess you could say it like that. Or so you could say there's the book of nature, and then there's the book of the Bible. And the book of nature represents like what everyone knows, and the way to read the book of nature is through philosophy and various related disciplines. And so there, I think Aristotelianism I found Aristotelianism to be, and particularly Thomism as a brand of that, to be a very helpful tool in reading the book of nature to understand the bigger questions and understand how they relate to God and everything. And then, but there's the book of the Bible, which is God has specially, as a Christian, I believe that God has specially revealed himself in the course of history. And not in ways that we could derive from nature, because history has to do with like particular events and nature has to do with generalities and repetitive events. So, so for me, the question is like, okay, let's study each of these books, but let's make sure that once we're finished reading both of these books, they are painting the same picture and not painting different pictures.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the sort of the tools, or the raw materials that we're looking at here, right? So, for example, if I were to evaluate my theology, I would say that if looking from your perspective, you would also use, I guess, but the Bible as revelation. and then you would also use, as you presented the book of nature, as maybe look at it from a philosophical perspective too, right? And using logic and rationality to make sense of everything. Mm-hmm. So let's start at the beginning then, at the Bible, because we sort of covered the philosophy part of and how you use those tools, right? So what is your view on the Bible? Is it, there are many literalists. Some say it's just literature, but divinely inspired at the same time. How would you put it?
I guess I would say the Bible's a collection of books written over a long period of time, inspired by God, and therefore authoritative. And the purpose of it is to record and reveal the way that God has, I would say record and explore the way that God has revealed himself in history for the salvation of humanity. I guess I would say something like that. And so in terms of, it is literature in the sense that they're books, and the books are written in particular ways, but I wouldn't ever say I'm literalistic in the sense that I try and make everything in the Bible literal. I would try and, like I read any book, I would try and read it on its own terms. So I try to understand, how does the author think? What are the issues that the author would be grappling with? What are the literary tools that the author has at their disposal? And even philosophical tools, I guess, to explore questions. And how do they explore those questions? And sometimes that'll be, with literal accounts. Other times it'll be with figurative accounts. Sometimes it'll be a mixture of the two.
So you look at the stories in the Bible as some are actually literal, right? And some might be allegorical or metaphorical, or maybe actually presented as legend, right? Something not to believe, but we can still learn from it.
Yeah. So I kind of think of, to give some examples, like obviously there's the parables of Jesus, which are presented as stories that he's trying to use to teach things about, or teach about himself in the kingdom of God. But I'm slight at the moment. I mean, I go back and forth on this, but I'm inclined to consider like Job to be kind of an extended parable, to be like a story it's more of an exploration of wisdom through a set of characters than it is like an account of an actual dialogue that happened. It's just, it uses the framing of a conversation between friends to explore deeper questions about what we can know about God and justice in light of the fact that bad things happen to good people.
So you say that the Bible is divinely inspired, right? How? Because it's not like in the same of how Islam would you make the Quran as the literal word of God, right?
Yeah. So I would probably say, there's different parts of the Bible that you might say are words from God. Maybe the 10 Commandments, were given by God in Hebrew or something. But for the most part, I would say that it's, the traditional way that Christians have understood the doctrine of inspiration, that we've understood it through three lenses or three things about it. We've said that I say traditional. I mean, I don't know when we started using these categories, but I think you can find these categories you can find people thinking in terms of these categories, even if they haven't articulated them, for a while. So I would say the Christians tend to think of inspiration as confluent, plenary, and verbal. Right. So let me define what those are in reverse order. So verbal means that God has inspired the writing of the Bible down to the very word, down to the individual words. Plenary means that he's inspired all of it. So it's not just that he's inspired down to the words of, say, Job and Isaiah, but he's done it across the board for every book in the Bible. And then confluent means that he's done it through the human authors writing it. So the human author's purpose such that the human author's purpose in a passage or in writing a particular passage is the divinely intended purpose of that passage. And he would have done this, I imagine, the way that it gets referred to in the Bible by people like Jesus and then also in Christian theology is that he's done it by the Holy Spirit superintending the processes. So you can imagine they are normal historical processes that would be going, like we're even told about them in the Bible, right? Like Moses is told to record events that they have when they fight against other nations, or Jeremiah is told to write down his prophecies in his book, and then it gets burnt, and then he gets told to write another book. Luke goes around and interviews a bunch of reporters, interviews a bunch of witnesses about what happened in the life of Jesus, and so on. And so they're kind of doing, most of the time, they're doing kind of normal human ways of writing documents, but at least the traditional understanding of divine inspiration is that God, through the Holy Spirit, is superintending that process, so in order to keep it free of error, and ensure that the final product is the divinely intended product. So that would intersect with questions about, providence and all those other things that we might want to get into. But I would say something like that.
So let's look at Genesis here, because that's there's a huge I guess discussion, creation science, and generally
Oh, is there? I hadn't heard of one. Yeah.
So
sure.
Where do you stand on it? Old Earth, new Earth, young Earth?
Yeah, I guess so. For me, you got to separate two questions out when you come to Genesis. And I guess we could say the creation evolution debate. You've got, on the one set of views, you've got like almost I don't know what you could say, but a position on what actually happened. So is the world actually 6,000 years old? Is the world actually billions or millions of billions of years old? What actually happened, regardless of what the Bible says? And then the second question is, what does the author of Genesis want to teach, in particularly the early chapters of Genesis, right? And I think it's important to separate those two things, because from my perspective, I don't think Genesis can really be used one way or the other to conclude, the truth or falsity of evolution, or a lot of the questions really that we ask today about biological diversity, the mechanisms by which it came about, the chronology of all the events, or like the age of the earth. Like, those aren't really questions that ancient authors were grappling with. They're very late questions in the history of humanity. So it's like asking, it's like, it's as if I was talking to you about Aristotelian philosophy, and then you said, okay, so how does it impact the way that I make my cup of tea? It's just like, you're not in the same ballpark in terms of what kinds of questions are being asked and how to answer those, and even how do we go about answering those questions. So I think that's the first thing to realize, is that there is a distinction between these two questions. You could say, for instance, that the Genesis doesn't teach one way or the other about the age of the earth, but be convinced, let's say, by the evidence that the earth is actually really young. Okay. Or you could say that Genesis doesn't say one way or the other what's happening, but it does say some things, but not enough to tell us, which view is correct. And then you think that the evidence points in the direction of evolution. Cool. That's how you go. But that's different from saying the Bible teaches evolution, or the Bible teaches 7-day creationism. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that's the first thing I think that's not answering a question entirely yet, but I think that's the first like methodological point that I would want to make when talking to someone about this, is we can't assume upfront that the questions that the author of Genesis was asking and grappling with are the same questions that that we're so interested in today. And I'm pretty confident they weren't, because if you just look at like the kinds of questions people were asking like 1,600 years ago, they're completely different, and you wouldn't recognize them, never mind going even further back. And when we do look at the questions that the people around the time, ancient people in Babylonia and Mesopotamia were looking at, they weren't grappling with the kinds of questions that we grapple with at all, So that's the first thing. I don't know if you want to ask me questions about that, or otherwise I can go on to say how then I do read Genesis.
Yeah, but before that, I guess, but I would say though that it does matter what you believe actually happened there in the end. If, for example, like, let's talk about the Adam and Eve and the serpent narrative. That whole story is essential to a lot of Christian doctrines, right? What the events that happened there, that to some, if not literal, if happened, let's say from an evolutionary perspective, would devastate or be fatal to a lot of salvation doctrines and whatnot. But would you say that it has the same effect for you, right? Like that on how you interpret Genesis?
So I don't think it impacts on the reality of salvation. I think it impacts on your views on inerrancy, so whether the Bible contains errors or not. So if you think that the author of Genesis wants you to believe that the events of the garden, for instance, literally happened as they did, and you also believe that those events didn't happen, right? Then you have to believe that the author of Genesis is wrong. You also have to believe that Paul, in his thinking, is wrong in thinking that there is an historical Adam, and so on. But it doesn't impact the broader questions of the reality of sin, how sin impacts our relationship with God, how Jesus died for sin, and how we can be made right with God, and all that kind of stuff. Do you see what I mean? Like, it doesn't impact salvation as such. It just impacts it impacts our doctrine of Scripture, not our doctrine of salvation. Well, I guess it does impact our doctrine of salvation a little bit, but not to the point where it destroys it. It mainly impacts our doctrine of.
So then let's get down to what you actually believe happened.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we kind of are mostly interested in the Genesis prologue, which is roughly Genesis 1 to 11. And we can sort of take it in different sections. I mean, the prologue itself is broken up naturally, not in the chapters that we have later imposed upon it, but if you look at the book of Genesis, it's broken down into the beginning, and then it's the generations of the heaven and the earth, and then it's the generations of Adam, the generations of Noah, the generations of the sons of Noah, and then the generations of something else, Shem, right? And then once you get to the generations of Terah, that's where you start the story of Abraham and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which takes up the next 12 to 50, chapters 12 to 15, I think. So I think that's a natural way to break it up. Like, you want to think about it the way that the author structured it, not the way that we've happened to put numbers on these things thousands of years later. So in the beginning, there's that creation week. That's the beginning of the creation week. I think the literary framework interpretation is a good interpretation of the creation week. On my blog, I have a very long document, it's 100 pages long, that goes through the Genesis prologue as a whole, and I give some defenses of my different positions. But the creation week I take to be literary framework interpretation, which means that I think the author is teaching us important truths about God and his relation to the world, but none of these truths include facts about the chronology or the actual events that occurred. It's more like it's teaching us things more like. Sorry, I'm just blanking. If I think of some of the debates that happened, some of the ideas that are getting tossed around in the ancient Near East, people, the different creation stories are talking about gods having genealogies of themselves, so the gods are being birthed from other gods. There being wars between the gods. That creation is like an accident that comes out as a result of war between these different gods. That the gods are part of creation in some sense, like they're intimately connected with the sun or the moon or something like that. That only kings are made in the image of God. That's mostly what you see when you see the phrase image of God in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, although there is one exception, I believe, in Egypt. You get things like that. And if you understand that, those are the kinds of debates that are happening. Like, what is the world? Has the world always been around? How did it come into existence? And then you come to Genesis, you're getting all the answers to that question, right? There's one God. There's no strife between the gods because there's only one will, so there can't be any strife. That God doesn't begin to exist. He's there in the beginning. That God is supreme over everything that he creates, and he's the creator of everything. He isn't in creation, but he does care for creation. All of humanity are created in his image, not just kings. So you get a lot of answers to the questions that are really foundational, I guess, to a theology and were really being grappled with in the ancient times, but they aren't answers to questions that we're interested in. That's not true. I mean, I think we should be interested in those questions, but we've in a sense moved on to different questions, and now we want to try and read other questions back into Genesis. So that would be the creation week. You want to stop me there and ask me questions, or should I continue with the rest of the?
By the way, so in terms of Creation Week, right? Are you looking at something like, oh, God clicked it and then made a really old Earth?
I don't think the Creation Week is disclosing us about the exact mechanisms by which God made creation or how long it took. It's it's using the week as a metaphor for like a piece of work that God engaged in. Kind of like, a normal work week. So if you look at the Jewish work week, right, it's like you work for 6 days and then you rest on the 7th, right? And so the way that the week metaphor was being, or the week, I guess you could say a metaphor, is being used to represent God's creative work. And then he rests from that work on the 7th day, which extends to the rest of creation. So we're currently in the 7th day now, because God's no longer like bringing creation to existence. How long did creation take? That's not a question they were interested in. Did it happen through evolution, or did things literally come from the ground? Again, not really questions that they're interested in. It's more like, how many gods are there? Are those gods part of creation? How do humans relate to this God? Does God care about creation or not? Do the gods need to be fed? Those are the sorts of questions that are being answered in the Creation Week. So then I think so I would say evolution is a pretty good description of what happened. I mean, that seems to be where the evidence points, but you have to answer the question. And I think you pointed this out, and I think it's a good point. You have to answer the question like, okay, but what about Adam and Eve, right? Like there's that story after the Creation Week, the first story in the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. That's what it's called. Very long title. With Adam and Eve, and you've also got Cain and Abel and Seth. They're all part of that same part of the story. And you got to ask like, okay, so there's two questions again to ask. Are these real individuals that are being spoken of? And are these events that are spoken of these individuals literally happening? Now, I would say, yes, they are real individuals. And the reason I would say that is because they are included, Adam and Eve are, Adam at least, but we can say by Eve by relation to Adam, I guess. They are included in genealogies. And genealogies for ancient people was the way that you historically locate people, right? You say a lot of the prophets will start like in the third year of this king of this time, the son of this person did this, right? That's a way of locating what's happening, like locating where we are, okay? And Adam appears in the genealogies in Genesis and genealogies elsewhere. So from what I can tell, the Genesis author, even though I don't think he cares how long those genealogies are, I think there's some interesting debate there's an interesting discussion to be had there. The fact that he includes Adam in genealogies, going all the way through to Abraham, indicates that he believes Adam is an historical individual, and that he plays an important role in the beginning of humanity. However, when I look at the particulars of the story, it seems to me that the author of Genesis is describing the events of Adam and Eve in language that he and his contemporaries would have taken to be obviously metaphorical. So the fact that, just to give like maybe, I don't know, 2 examples, the fact that Adam is said to be made out of the dust of the ground, right? That is a Jewish metaphor for mortality. And you can see that because in Job, for instance, in the dialogue in Job, one of his friends, I forget which one, will say like, one of the people says like, we're all made from the dust of the ground. Now, obviously that person, the Jewish people at that time, they knew where babies came from. But they affirmed that nevertheless, because that was their way of saying, we are mortal. We are not purely spiritual beings. We are these like limited beings. And so from dust we come, into dust we go when we die. And so what you see in Genesis is that the author in his story is I guess you could call it a mytho-historical thing. So he's describing historical events, but in a mythological way, using metaphors that are common in Jewish thought, as if they're, describing them as if they're really what happened. It would be like if there's a psalm that talks about God knitting us in my mother's womb, knitting me in my mother's womb. I think it's Psalm 51. It would be like, so we all understand that to be a metaphor, right? Like God isn't literally knitting people in wombs. That's not like how that works. It would be like as if the author of Genesis was like, okay, so God, when he was creating man, he got down, he got his knitting needles out, and he knitted Adam into existence. right? He and all his contemporaries understood that that was not really what happened, but in the way that he's presenting it, in the story that he's presenting, he presents it as such. Not because he's lying, because it's just everyone understands that that's not supposed to be taken literally, even though he's describing something that did happen, namely an individual came into existence. Now, the reason that an author would use a mythological or metaphorical way of speaking about things is because it's just in the distant past. Remember, the Genesis prologue is talking about what is ancient history to the author of Genesis, not just ancient history to us. And so he's saying, okay, something happened. I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm going to paint a picture for you about what happened so I can teach you key theological points to set up the story for Abraham that's to come, where God is going to fix all the problems. So that's only one example. I guess the other example would be, what's another example? I'm trying to think of some. I'm blanking now. But there are a few. I guess the fact that God walks around in the garden freely as if he's a material being, and the author doesn't draw much attention to it. So later in Genesis, so it's the same, later in Genesis, when God fights with Jacob, or when God appears to Abraham at the the trees of, I think it's Moriah or something. No, that's the mountains of Moriah. There's some, I forget exactly what trees he appears to him at. There's like a Hebrew way of making you pay attention. It's like, and often in contemporary English translations, it'll say "behold," right? And that's like you got to pay attention. It's almost as like today, I guess we would write things in italics or something like that to like really draw attention to something that's happening. So every time God appears in a material form in Genesis, there's this like indication that that's a really big deal. That's like a really strange thing for him to do. But we don't see that in the story in the garden, which suggests that the author isn't really expecting you to take it as like what literally happened, but there's some truth to there's some historical truth of what's being conveyed, maybe a special relationship that Adam and Eve had with God before they sinned or something like that. So for that reason, I tend to take the generations of the heavens and the earth in a more mytho-historical reading. Yeah, so when I was doing my work on the Genesis prologue, and I have some of this in my notes that I mentioned on my blog, one of the questions I asked was, did humans eat animals? Did they kill animals before the fall? Because I don't know, these days when you're taught about it, you kind of think that didn't happen. And I actually think that they did kill and eat animals before the fall, and it was always fine. And I think a large part of this has to do with the fact that the Hebrew understanding, which informs the writing of Genesis, doesn't see the death of animals as something like morally problematic. So if you look at, I think it's Psalm 104, Psalm 107, I forget which one exactly. For some reason, 4 and 7 are very, in my memory, they're related to each other for some reason. The author is praising God for the way that he creates and conserves the world, right? And when he looks at the prey being given to the lion or to the beasts, he praises God for it. He's like, praise be to you that you do this, that you provide for the animal. And to him, the fact that one animal is eating another isn't a problem. It's something to be praised that God provides for some animals. So I think that's not to say that we shouldn't care for animals. I'm not advocating for animal cruelty, because I think part of the point of us being made in the image of God is that we should care for creation. But that care, yeah, I know, yeah. But that care, at least as from what I can tell, doesn't mean that that animal death is something that's intrinsically wrong, intrinsically bad. It means that when we kill animals, we should do it in a way that doesn't cause them unnecessary pain. So I don't, from my perspective, I mean, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but from what I can tell, the biblical ethic, or at least to the author of Genesis, if you want to, question inerrancy because you're convinced of veganism or something, but to the author of Genesis or to the Hebrew thinker, the death of animals isn't intrinsically a bad thing. And so God using a process of evolution to do that is something almost to be praised, that God created an orderly system where animals are provided for, sometimes at the cost of other animals' lives. Well, yeah, I mean, he created humans in such a way that we were able to bring evil into the world, right? Or bring sin into the world. Like, that's the Bible teaches that, right? Like, God created Adam and Eve, and then Paul clearly, well, I mean, if you want any clearer, Romans 5 talks about how sin entered the world through Adam's trespass. So it's like, yeah. So yeah, we believe that God created the world. So yeah, I think in general, you want to say evil is the frustration of the good, or the privation of good. But frustration is a pretty good word. And I guess there's two kinds that we can talk about. There's natural evil and there's moral evil. So natural evil would be anything where a creature's natural flourishing is somehow frustrated. That would be like if I'm sick, right? That would be a natural evil. Or if my leg got cut off or something, or I don't have a leg, that would be a natural evil because it goes contrary to my nature as a bipedal living organism, right? And then there's moral evil, which has to do with how our self-conscious choices. So we as like rational animals are capable of understanding things and pursuing things in a self-aware way, or I guess you could say a rational way. And there, to the extent that we actively or we willfully choose something that's contrary to the good, that's moral evil. So something where our wills are involved would be moral evil. So I guess to some extent, natural evil is always part of creation if evolution is true. Whether natural evil is part of the new creation is a good question. I don't know. But moral evil would have been introduced, at least among humans, would have been introduced by Adam and Eve. Yeah, there's a lot you can go into here. But I think in general, at least in this first creation, we can get into why in this first creation and not the next creation. But in this first creation, I think the way you approach the problem of evil as a Christian is at least a theoretical problem of evil. So now you're trying to answer the question, the intellectual question, why does a good God allow evil? If you're talking about like an existential problem of evil, which is more like, how do I live in a world with evil? You're going to get a very different answer, right? But talking about like a theoretical problem of evil, you want to say that like God doesn't desire suffering or cause evil, but he permits it for the sake of bringing about greater goods. And then you can ask, okay, how does that work out, like in particular ways? But there are, I guess that's kind of what you want to say. So I can go through some examples of how you might piece this together. And I would say like maybe freedom is some part of it, but I think there's...
Is that how you look at it though, that God permits evil for the greater good?
Yeah, he doesn't do the evil or cause the evil. So that's important. So there's a difference between permitting something and causing something. So he doesn't desire it or cause it, but he creates things that are limited, knowing that they have the potential to fail. But he orchestrates the history in such a way that he can bring greater goods out of their failures. So that I guess you could say on balance, it's better than it would have been, but that's not quite how you should think about it. He's not like balancing scales. So I can give you some examples. Like, I mean, a really obvious example is, what's best for us is not that we have a pleasant time, but that we develop our character and know God more deeply, right? And sometimes that is best served through some process of suffering, right? Like, in order for us to have fully formed characters, we need to know what is good, we need to desire it, and we need to have the self-control necessary to work for it. So that requires that we practice things like patience, humility, trust, forgiveness, mercy, self-sacrifice, courage. I don't know, I can go on. And a lot of these involve or require some kind of pain or can be brought out of pain or difficulty. And so you can see how God may be wanting to develop the character of his creatures to be able to better live with him, would then be okay with them corrupting his creation for a bit, in anticipation of the new creation, so that he could use it to bring about these greater goods in us, this development of character. Now, of course, I'm saying we are doing it, he's not doing it. So you have to understand that it's really important that we distinguish between what God desires and causes and what he merely permits. So there does need to be a distinction of the agency there, that we are agents of our own decisions and so on, but that doesn't come at the cost of God's control over history. So that would be one example. of it. But I mean, the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes, they talk about other examples. And you could probably list, 6 or 7 different examples of ways that, or examples of how God might permit evil for the sake of bringing about greater goods.
And I'm really curious because you're someone who subscribes to Aristotelian, I guess, like a method and understanding nature of reality. So how would you look at the nature of man here? Because are you looking at some kind of like I'm a human being with like a material and immaterial part?
Yeah. So the Thomist position is probably the more fully developed one in light of Christian teaching and other things. Thomas developing the work from Aristotle. So Thomas Aquinas, I mean. So I would subscribe to something that Thomas Aquinas teaches, which is basically called hylomorphic dualism. It's a nice big phrase for people. So it's best to contrast it with a category we know today, which is Cartesian dualism, right? So that's the view of Descartes, where what you are is a soul. You are a soul, this immaterial thing, and you drive a body, but you're not your body. The body is kind of like a tool that you drive, similar to a car, right? That's not the sort of dualism that we're talking about in Thomism. So hylomorphic dualism says you are one thing. Your body and your mind and everything it's one unity, like one unified existence that has, you could say it has material parts and immaterial parts, but a better way to say that is you do different things. You're capable of doing different things, right? So like I can outstretch my hand, I can walk across the room, I can do all these different things, right? And so we could call those powers. The powers are the different things I can do. Now you can ask, how do those powers depend on my body? To what extent do they depend on my body? So to give you an example, I can't raise my left hand if I don't have a left hand. Like if I get my left arm cut off, right, then I no longer have the ability to raise my left hand, right? So we say my power to raise my left hand is intrinsically dependent upon my body, particularly my left arm. So now you can say, okay, well, what about, are all my powers intrinsically dependent upon some part of my body? Or are some of them only extrinsically dependent? That is, they use my body, but they could function in some way outside of the body, probably in an incomplete way. So they would need to be reunited with the body to be fully complete again. But is that possible? And so that's where the Thomist says, yes, you can, your rational powers, your abilities to abstract universal concepts, to tie those concepts together into arguments, to make judgments about reality that involve universals and so on. And your will, your rational desire about like what you perceive as good, those work through a body in the course of everything, similar to maybe how your arm works through your heart in a way. It depends on your body. But they can continue to exist in some very thin sense, to the point where, Aquinas he's not even comfortable saying that you're a human. He's kind of like, you're kind of like a disembodied soul isn't really a human. It would be like, imagine if I cut your legs off, then I cut your arms off, I'm making you kind of less capable to flourish as a human. Then I cut your torso off, and then I destroy your head, right? Like this, what he says is there's something left of you. There's some power left of you, but it's so little that you're radically incomplete. And so in order for you to be properly complete, you need to be, resurrected in a physical body. So that is the view that I would take.
So if that's the case, then does it match well with your views on, acts and potency theory, intentions? Yeah.
It requires that you move from that, that central place into a bit of philosophy of mind. You try and get an account of what happens when you know things, because you want to know how do your rational powers work from the, within the framework of act, potency, form, matter, and all that stuff. And then that enables you to talk about whether your intellect and your will intrinsically or extrinsically depend on your body. But that's a very involved thing. And I'm not like, I kind of understand it. Like, I'll be honest with you, the philosophy of mind isn't my first, it's not I'm not particularly like well read in it. I've read enough to be kind of like, yeah, okay, those arguments make kind of sense to me. But I mean, to be honest with you, like if tomorrow was proven wrong, I don't think I would change much. I would still believe a human is a full matter composite, that you're still you're still capable of rational thought and all those things. That just, yeah, I don't think it impacts much.
Awesome. And I guess one huge topic I want to cover here, I will cherish this. And I guess in terms of the nature of God, and let's divide it to sort of three subtopics. I want to say, do you hold the Thomas of ADS, absolute divine simplicity, and then how do you, if yes or no, maybe, but what is that? How is it then correlated to the Trinity and Christ's incarnation?
Oh, geez. Okay, so let me tell you something about this. So, I'm a huge fan of reading. I mean, I read Aristotle and I read Thomas Aquinas, right? Like that's like I have fun reading them because I've been reading them long enough now that they make sense to me, But because I mean they're in a very different worldview, so it's you need to kind of get into it a bit. But like, I'll tell you, like a while ago when I was reading Aquinas's views on the Trinity, when I first read it a few times, like I would get dizzy thinking about all the distinction that you need to make in order to articulate it. And eventually, after I read it, I would come back to it occasionally to see like, okay, do I understand a bit more of this now that I've spent some more time thinking about these things? And like I would slowly make progress. And so eventually I've gotten to the point where I think I have a rudimentary grasp of the Thomist view of the Trinity. The incarnation still makes me dizzy when I try and read it. So I don't know how much I can tell you about that, but I can at least tell you how I understand the Christian, the church's creeds about the incarnation, and say that, yes, that's what we want to affirm as a Thomist. But okay, so to answer your first question, absolute divine simplicity, maybe could you tell me how you define that? Because the word absolute has two different senses, and I want to make sure that I'm answering the exact question that you're asking.
I would say I'd say like the modified distinction, divine simplicity would be better than, like, for example, like from basically divine simplicity is like there are all parts of God are identical, right? And it's just but he could have attributes that have sort of distinctions, like God is love and God is justice, but they're all, I guess, of one essence.
Yeah. Okay. So I would affirm that there are no absolute distinctions in God. I would not affirm that there are absolutely no distinctions in God. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see the difference there? So if you say there's absolutely no distinctions in God, what you're saying is there's no way to make any distinction whatsoever, which must be false if we're talking about the Trinity, right? Because there is a distinction between Father and Son and Holy Spirit. But if you say there's no absolute distinction in God, what we're saying is you have absolute properties and you have relative properties. An absolute property would be something like my height, right? My height is, I don't know, what is my height? I don't know. Let's say 1.6 meters. I don't know if that's really what my height is, but let's say my height is 1.6 meters. That's an absolute property. I have a relative property, which is I am taller than my wife. That's a relative property, okay? So when we're saying there's no absolute distinction, what we're saying is that the absolute properties of God are all grounded in the same fundamental reality, namely his being. And I say grounded because I think, I can get into that if we want, but I think it's a bit of a category error to say that, or it can be a bit confusing to say God's knowledge is his power. But what we can say is the ground of God's knowledge and the ground of his God's power are one and the same thing. I think that's a more helpful way of speaking about it today. But if we deny absolute distinctions, we can still affirm relative distinctions. And that's where the Thomist position comes in. The Thomist position says that the distinction between the persons of the Trinity is grounded in real distinctions, real substantive distinctions that exist in God, which involve relative opposition, but are nevertheless all have their foundation in the being of God. And that's just a sentence full of jargon. I appreciate that, and I'm sorry about that. But that's a key move there, I think, that we have to appreciate. When we talk about absolute divine simplicity, there's a difference between saying there's absolutely no distinction and there's no absolute distinction.
Yeah, and I wouldn't, I guess, like, no Christian would go far as to say that God has no, like, absolutely have no distinction, you know. Yeah. So in that case, then, right, in sort of that definition of divine simplicity, how do you look at the Trinity? Like,
yeah, I guess so. Here you need to appreciate. So this gets a bit in the weeds. I'll try and summarize it as, I'll try to summarize it as briefly as possible. But like, you have to kind of appreciate, I think, the scholastic account of relations, or the Aristotelian account of relations and how they work. But I'll sketch it for you. So basically, when one thing is related to another, there's two things to consider. There's the foundation of the relation in the thing that's related, and there's that foundation with respect to the other thing. So let me give you an example. There's your height and my height. If I want to say I am taller than you, then the foundation of that relation is my height, and the tallness is my height with respect to your height. Okay, so there's two components to a relation. There's the foundation itself inside the thing that's related, and then there's the I guess you could say the consideration or the relatedness of that foundation to another thing. So that's it gets more complicated. I mean, it gets complicated, but like, you know, so now there's different ways that can work. So in the case of height, what we're doing is a comparison. So we have the same property in two things, and we're kind of just quantitatively comparing them. You know, are they the same? Is the one greater than the other? Is the one less than the other? But there's other kinds of relations. So, a comparison is kind of like a symmetric kind of thing. So like whenever I'm compared to you in some way, you could be compared to me in a symmetric way. There's another kind of relation that obtains which is called a procession. The best example of procession is that we have is a cause, right? So in a cause you have, as I said in the previous podcast episode, in the cause you have some actuality, and the effect you have some potentiality, and that actuality actualizes that potentiality, right? So you can think like the brick has a certain velocity as it flies towards the window. That's the actuality. The window has a certain fragility that makes it susceptible to breaking upon certain kinds of impact. That's the potentiality. And so then the brick breaks the window when those things come into contact with each other. Okay. Now that's the procession is what occurs when it's like the relation of the cause to the effect in that case. Okay. Not every procession is a cause effect relation, but every cause effect relation is a procession. Now, the difference between processions and comparisons is that processions are intrinsically asymmetric. Okay, so there's a procession is from something to something, right? There's a from and a to. There's like almost a source and a target, if you can say that. There's a fromness and a to-ness. So so we call this, when a procession occurs, there's two relations that obtain. There's the breaking of the glass, and there's the being broken. There's the breaking and being broken. And those are two different relations, because it depends on how you're considering the relation from and to. Sorry if this is quite abstract. I appreciate. So what you have now is you have a relative opposition. So being broken is relatively opposed to breaking. You can't be broken and breaking in the same sense at the same time, right? You could do it in different senses or at different times, but it's not the same sense at the same time. Okay, so that's the thing. So we have a foundation. Foundations are related to each other, and when those foundations are related to each other, as a procession is a relative opposition that is like an intrinsic distinction within the relatedness of the relation. So now, in the case of God, in the case of rational animals, we have, and now this gets, when we're when we are thinking about things or desiring things, so intellection and volition, they are what we can call internal processions. So when I think about something, I produce something in me by which I know the thing that I'm thinking about. You know, there's like an internal, it's called an inner word by Aquinas, but you could call it like an internal, you can think of it as maybe like a concept that you have. It's not quite a concept, but that's the closest thing we have in modern thought. Similarly, with volition, when I love something, there is in me a new thing, a love that is produced. So there's me as a lover, and then there's the love in me, okay, for another thing. Now, in humans, these things are distinct, right? Like I am distinct from my love. I am distinct from my concepts. But in God, everything, every absolute thing is the same thing as his being or as his substance. And so in God, what we have is he's not a rational animal, but he's a rational being. So in God, you have intellection and volition, but the concept, you could say, it's not really a concept again, or the love, just is his substance, is his being. So you have a procession from his being to his being. So the foundations are the same. There's no two foundations here. There's one foundation. However, because it's a procession, you recall the relatedness is intrinsic. There's like a relative opposition in the procession itself that enables us to make a distinction from a from and a to. So we can distinguish God with respect to this relation. We can say God as knower and God as known. Similarly, we can talk about God as lover and God as loved. And then you can argue that these have to collapse into three. So the knower and the known are the lover, but they can't be each other and they can't be the loved. And that gets into like more things. But the idea here is that these processions have these intrinsic relative distinctions in them. And that helps us distinguish between the persons of the Trinity. So what we traditionally ascribe to God the Father would be, in this analogy, would be God the knower, and God as known would be, or the Logos would be God the Son, and God as loved would be the Holy Spirit. But yeah, you have to, the amount of distinctions you need to make in order to like actually flesh that entire picture out is quite astounding. And it's not surprising, right? I mean, talking about the Trinity in God, it's like the being that we have the least access to intellectually, and like one of the most complicated doctrines that we know about, so it's no wonder that it involves a lot of nuance and distinction, but that's basically how it works. So through the relative oppositions inside God, we can demarcate really distinct individuals without having to say that God is really distinct in his being in an absolute sense.
So here's a question, I guess, like for I'm actually been asking this one too. Like, was God always a Trinity, or was it simply necessary for him to present himself as a Trinity to us because of how our the reality of our nature works?
Wait, so are you asking, is God actually a Trinity, or does he just speak about himself as a Trinity, or are you saying, was he always a Trinity?
No, I'm guessing like is a Trinity simply as a necessary way for him to present himself to us due to our creation? Because like if he is this infinite being, then he could be like in some at some perspective he could be like a quadrinity or any infinity.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess if you go with this, so this intellectual analogy that I'm talking about here, that goes back to Augustine and is developed by Aquinas. If you go by that, then no, there's only three, because there's only two rational powers, the intellect and the rational faculties or powers, intellection and volition, fundamentally. And you shouldn't introduce distinctions into God that you don't have to, because he's, he's simple. So you don't want to make arbitrary distinctions in him. So yeah, that analogy wouldn't allow you to justify any more than three.
Yeah, I guess it's something so it's sort of irrelevant.
And then, I mean, he reveals himself as three in the scriptures. So I don't know why he wouldn't reveal himself as more if he were more. But yeah, I guess there's to some extent, you just got to trust what God reveals about himself. And that's true of anyone. Like I can only, if you tell me about yourself, I have to trust what you tell me about yourself. Like that's kind of how I need to go. And so, he's revealed himself to be Trinity. So that's what we got to go with, I guess. But yeah, if he did happen to be 4 or 5 or 6, the analogy of the intellectual analogy that I've given, probably it wouldn't work. I don't know how you would make it work for more than three.
Mm-hmm. So so I guess then that would you like to talk about the Christ as both man and God then?
I mean, I can try. I guess the key thing there is that I think what the councils have worked out over the years was that the unity happens in the person of Christ, not in some other part of him. And so, yeah, I mean, it's pretty difficult, to be honest with you. Like, I haven't quite fully internalized the distinctions needed to make it, but I guess basically there's something like there's something like a person is a being with a rational nature, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that every new rational nature produces a new person, if that rational nature was created for that person. But that's about as far as I can go on that one. It's I kind of understand some things, but I don't want to speak out of turn there. Like I'll defer to someone much smarter than me to talk about that. Yeah.
Okay, then I guess like if you would allow me one last question, bro, because it's been awesome talking to you, and I want to dive into some eschatology because I just watched a Netflix show called Messiah. I admit it was really entertaining, and so from your perspective, right? Like you do believe that Christ will come again, and there will be this Armageddon and all this tribulation and stuff. But how do you I guess like understand the book of Revelations, or basically, or simply the prophecy?
Yeah, so I should say I don't know what the show Messiah talks about, so I'm not commenting on that because I haven't watched it. So let me just make that point out front. Jesus will return. There will be a general resurrection. We will be made what Paul calls spiritual beings, but he doesn't mean that we won't have bodies. So if you want to ask me what that means, I can answer that. There will be a new creation without sin and evil. Whether that involves all natural evil remains to be seen. I don't know, but there won't be sin, which is a pretty big deal. And yeah, we'll live in perfect relationship with God. I mean, for eternity. That's I believe that. I affirm all that. I would say so. In general, methodologically, I don't think we should go to Revelation first for when we build an eschatology. I think we should read the biblical story as a whole and read Revelation as the end of that whole and not start at the end. So Paul has a lot to say in his theology, or his development of theology, and Jesus has a few things to say about the end times. And they aren't couched in apocalyptic language, which is notoriously difficult to understand, and not least of which because we don't have a good appreciation of I guess you could say, the picture world that would have been accessible to John and his original readers. So for that, you really want to have a good understanding of the Old Testament, both the apocalyptic and the non-apocalyptic language, before you try and interpret Revelation, because he's using a lot of imagery that's coming up in books like Daniel and Isaiah, and he's like reusing it in different ways. And you really have to understand how it was originally meant to really get at what he's getting at, if you know what I mean. And so to me, if you want to start building an eschatology, the first place is you start is first you need to, really get to grips with the story of the Bible as a whole and like how that story progresses and so on. But then secondly, if you need to start anywhere, right? Because it can be difficult to say, read the whole Bible. That's quite a difficult thing to do. Study the whole Bible is even harder. But I would be to start with the more lucid passages. And by lucid, I mean, maybe not lucid isn't the right word, but passages where the Bible is talking explicitly and non-figuratively about what's happening, right? So Paul is arguing in Romans, and he's telling us in Romans 8 about what the end will look like and about how the present connects with the end. Romans 8, Romans 11 talks about it. Jesus talks about the end times and He's just talking plainly to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sometimes he talks in parables. But yeah, Paul in, I think it's 1 Thessalonians. The Thessalonians had a huge trouble with, has the second coming already happened? How should we think about it? What about our friends who've already died? How are they going to be, what's going to happen to them? So that you want to look at 1 Thessalonians, you want to look at 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul works out a theology of the resurrection of the dead. Those are all the places you want to start with your eschatology, where you want to understand the fundamental things that keep coming up over and over and over again. And then you can go to Revelation, once you've got all that in place, to try and figure out, okay, what is this telling me in addition to those things, or how is it confirming that, or how is it fleshing out that picture more? That said, I have not spent much time in Revelation because I'm still doing the first 2 steps of that process. I tend to be an amillennial in the way that I classify myself, but like I'm not really even sure the millennial, postmillennial, amillennial debate is something that the authors of scriptures even like are engaging with. So I'm like tentatively an amillennial until I look into it more. But yeah, it's I'm not sure if the whole millennial debate is something that's sort of more recent than the biblical authors were engaging with. So that's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry, but that's, yeah.
It's okay. Okay, then to end it, like if we're in this stage of this God and man relationship narrative, right? And we're on in between, after Christ's ascension and before his second coming. So what do we do in the meantime, bro?
What do we do in the meantime? You ended both of our episodes with the same question, basically. No, yeah, it's a good question. So I think we have to live in light of the future. So we have to live in the light that the thing that we're walking towards, the journey that we're on like a pilgrimage. I like the analogy of a pilgrimage. I think Peter talks about, actually, sorry, let me say it like this. If we were to pick a time frame of the Old Testament that would be analogous to the time frame we're in now, what time frame would we pick? And I think the answer to that question is we're in the wilderness. So we have been saved. The enemy, the great enemy, has been defeated and disarmed, right? But we haven't yet taken hold of the full extent of the promise that we've been given, right? So we're wandering in the wilderness. There's still difficulty, but we're with God, but there's still difficulty, right? And so sometimes it can be really helpful to say, okay, well, how should the Israelites have behaved in the wilderness? Well, not how they did, but what should they have done? Well, they should have looked forward to what was to come and live in light of that. So they shouldn't reason like, well, I'm not in heaven now, therefore I shouldn't act like a citizen of heaven. It's like, well, no, they were citizens of heaven. They were citizens of the promised land before they were in the promised land. And so we're citizens of heaven before we're in heaven, or before we're, in the new creation. And so we should live in light of that. And you actually, sorry, just on that, I could talk about this forever. Paul actually has a really good example of that language. It's a really fascinating phrase that he uses, or a reason that he uses in Romans 13. I think it's verse 8 to 11. He says, we should live as people who are awake, not asleep. So that's an analogy of don't live in sin, but live as people who are in the light now. Don't live in the darkness, but live in the light. We should live as people who are awake, but not asleep, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. So by salvation there, he's not talking about, are we saved from sin? He's talking about our salvation at the final judgment, that we escape the judgment for our sin because our sins have been dealt with in Christ. But he's saying, we're on our way to this day where we get to be with God. We're on our way to the quote unquote promised land. And the consequence of that is that we should live as people who are awake and not sleeping. Live as people in the light and not in the darkness. Which is interesting, isn't it? Like it's, I think today sometimes people want to be like, well, I don't have, people might be, I guess young Christians would be tempted to say, I don't have to worry about how I act because, my sins are forgiven and I'm going and in the future. And that's just not what the biblical authors think. The biblical authors is like, no, you're on your way. You're already a citizen of heaven. You're on your way there. And so live like a citizen of heaven. Do your best, even though you're going to fail because you're still, in this now in between with sin and the Holy Spirit working in you. You're kind of torn in two directions. Even though that's happening, you should, sow the things of heaven. You should, and now I'm mixing my metaphors, but you know what I mean? You should live as people, you should walk according to the Spirit, not according to the flesh. That's what he says in Romans 8. So I think that's a thing that maybe isn't always emphasized as much as the fact that our eschatology and what we're looking forward to should act as a motivation for us to live godly lives and to work to become more godly. Obviously, with the help of grace of God and all those things, not like by ourselves. It isn't an excuse to sit back and not think about it. That's the one thing. And I think the second thing is evangelism. So we know as Christians that where the world is heading, and we know how things are going to work out on the last day, and it's how people relate to are connected to Christ. And so we should work to help those around us to see that. I mean, I'm not saying we should force them or Bible bash them, but if you're at a dinner party and you're happy to talk about your politics, you should be happy to talk about your religion. You should be able to, or if you're happy to talk about your sports match, if that's important to you, but like you're not, and you should be happy to talk about Jesus, whatever form that takes. So different people that'll look different friend groups, or different people come from different places. And so you got to, accommodate that and so on. But yeah, there is a responsibility for us to like try and engage with the world around us, be lights to the world. Sorry, that's kind of a rambling answer, but those are some of my thoughts that come out of that, how eschatology should impact our.
And I really agree with you that as Christians, we should remain lights of the world here. But if in the case that Christ doesn't come in my lifetime and I die before that, I'd say, it's okay. And so So I mean, Paul, this is where you want to read. This is where you want to go to, like Philippians, right? Where he says, "To live is Christ, and to die is gain." So Paul was grappling. When he was talking to the Philippians, he was grappling with the fact that he was nearing death, right? Like he was in prison and he was pretty sure he was going to get executed. And he's like, I don't have much time to live. In one of his pastoral letters, I think it's to Timothy, he says, I'm being poured out like a drink offering. And what he means is he's not talking about anything like particularly deep. He's just saying when people did offerings in the Levitical system, sometimes what they would do is they would throw some wine on to the altar, right? But anyone who knows who's thrown wine onto a fire will know that it evaporates pretty quickly. You know what I mean? So he's saying like, my time is short. Like I don't have much time left. So particularly in his later epistles, he's grappling with that idea. Like I don't have a lot of time left. Like how do I live? And so the way he thought about it was, listen, if I live through this, if I don't get killed, or if for the rest of the time that I do live, I'm going to live for Christ. And if I die, well, I mean, I get to be with Christ, which is what I'm working towards, which is what I'm, walking towards anyway. So to live as Christ and to die is gain. Like I live for Christ now, and when I die, I get to be with the Christ that I've been living for this entire time. And I think that's an attitude that every Christian should aspire to have. It can be difficult sometimes when, the promises of the future seem so distant. And we're going through something like a global pandemic, say, and all the complications that come from that. But there's definitely something to hold on to, like a hope. Well, Roland, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man. I learned so much from you. And God bless, bro.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the questions. It's been great to chat about these topics, these very big topics. Thanks.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
University of Maryland Global Campus has more than 20 years' experience providing affordable online education to military service members and working adults. Offering low tuition, no-cost digital resources replacing most textbooks, scholarships for those who qualify, and more. Learn more at umgc.edu/podcast.
It used to be hard to find the exact auto parts you needed, and that meant spending a lot of time at swap meets. It's a different game now when you can order exactly what you need from eBay Motors. They have 122 million parts, so you can always find the right fitment. Spend less time searching and more time building with the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.